diagram, this label implies they are separate, and this encourages you to see them as unique and isolated from the term artwork. I want to know how strong that relationship is between art and diagrams. Have we fallen into an illusion where we presume these two types of visuals are entirely different? Suppose the relationship between abstract art and diagrams is strong. In that case, it should be possible to create artwork using the diagram as a starting point. We can use art to explore the connection between these two types of visuals. I'm going to create a piece of artwork using a bar chart as a starting point. I have the basic shapes that we would associate with a bar chart. I don't want to include any writing. Perhaps the use of writing distances a diagram from a piece of artwork. We don't often see writing as being an essential part of a piece of artwork, but in a diagram, it is crucial because it allows us to read and interpret the image. Suppose you're looking at a piece of artwork that includes writing. In that case, you can explore how important it is by removing the writing and then observing the difference. At this initial stage, this piece looks much less like a diagram. Without any writing, it no longer conveys information and it becomes solely visual. Although that isn't to say that I believe that writing isn't visual. Writing is a complex collection of symbols and it conveys a high amount of information. This image of a bar chart can no longer deliver that high level of information. It has been stripped down to its most basic aspects. Those basic parts are merely a collection of rectangles. It becomes easy to drift into creating a piece of abstract artwork using this as a starting point. When we strip the diagram down to its core aspects, we were left with the rectangle. This shape is a core component of a piece of art. The shape of the page is often a rectangle, and images often contain this basic shape. A piece of artwork is a mixture of complex and basic shapes. Diagrams are also a mixture of complexity and simplicity. The complexity is often within the information that is being portrayed, and as the diagram attempts to simplify that information, it becomes a balance of these two aspects. Simplicity and complexity are also a fundamental part of abstract art. There is a balance that must be obtained between the two. Abstract art can learn a lot from diagrams, and diagrams can learn a lot from abstract art. Let's create another piece of abstract art that begins from an image of a bar chart. An artist must nurture the ability to look at a single starting point and see many possibilities. They must be able to create many unique pieces of artwork from the same starting point. This is a greater test of your creativity. It is easier to have a different starting point because you can continuously respond using the same process and it will still lead to different results. Easier isn't always better. Using the same starting point will always be a greater challenge. To begin, I've gone into the Abstract Artist toolbox and I've chosen repetition. I've overlaid the bar chart on top of itself. Repetition immediately creates a higher amount of complexity. This starting point is incredibly simplistic. The level of complexity that is created by repetition is always decided by the complexity of the initial shape. If you begin with a shape that is high in complexity, then repetition will create a large amount of complexity. If you repeat a simple shape, then it is only a small increase in complexity. Take a look at the complexity already present in this drawing that I created. When these lines are repeated, you already know that it will create a high level of complexity. You know this because the image is already complex. As expected, the repetition creates a high level of complexity. This is immediate, but when you start with simple shapes like a set of rectangles, you know it will only create a small amount of complexity. So let's return to our simple shapes. These shapes seem even less exciting because we've just been looking at something far more complex. And it's sometimes difficult to see the value in those simple shapes, but they really strengthen a composition. If we look at this image, you will notice that there are many simplistic shapes. The most noticeable is the circle. It is a dominant part of this image. You'll also notice some rectangles. It's like we took our bar chart and scattered it throughout the piece. I can also see a few stretched triangles. This level of complexity relies on simplistic shapes to keep it balanced. Without that simplicity, the image would end up looking messy and chaotic. The abstract artist should see the importance of a simple rectangle or a series of rectangles. Colour is also another thing that adds complexity to an image. My use of colour isn't extreme. I haven't gone wild with my choices, and that's because I'm mindful of the current level of complexity. The image has a low level of complexity, and I've added an amount of colour that has the same level of complexity. I've done this because I want the level of complexity to grow in a balanced way. I want the complexity in colour to grow at the same rate as the complexity contained within the structure of the image. If I go wild with colour, the image will become unbalanced and the structure will seem weak. When I apply the same level of complexity, when it comes to colour, it will be balanced, making it easier to retain that balance as I continue with the piece. I now begin to add detail. And because of the low level of complexity, this piece of artwork conveys a level of peace or tranquility. I could make the piece incredibly complex, but sometimes you want to retain some subtlety in an image. I'm adding detail, but so far I've done nothing to alter those rectangles that dominate the piece. You'll notice an imbalance in the piece. When you focus on the colour purple, you'll see an imbalance. There is more purple at the top of the image than the bottom. The imbalance isn't overwhelming, but it doesn't convey the peace that I want to convey. I could have reduced the amount of purple at the top of the image, but instead I chose to add more at the bottom by adding some purple abstract shapes. Curves balance the harsh vertical lines of the rectangles. To create more balance, there needs to be more curves on the canvas. The image is mainly cool colours. Those blues and purples convey a level of peace, but a small amount of warmth will make the image more striking. I don't need the same amount of cold and warmth. I want more cool colours because it creates the effect that I'm aiming for. The piece of artwork will still be balanced. Those areas of warmth bring the piece together, and it doesn't lose its peaceful nature. There is also a high level of balance between the number of curves and the number of straight lines. The image doesn't have the same complexity as the image we viewed earlier, but it conveys something different. A piece of abstract art can express various feelings and ideas. Both diagrams and abstract artwork can communicate information through their expression of simplicity and complexity. We've begun with the basic bar chart shape again. We're going to create another piece of abstract art using the bar chart as the starting point. I've used repetition to duplicate the shapes of the rectangles and overlay them. Let's dive in and add some colour. At this stage, I've begun to add paint in a way that adds variations. There is the appearance of watercolour brushstrokes. This painterly effect isn't something that you see in diagrams. Diagrams tend to use flat colour without much variation. In some ways, it would seem odd to view a diagram that has visible brushstrokes. Some people might say that diagrams aren't painterly because diagrams are focused on delivering information. But many diagrams are still aesthetically pleasing. It could be said that abstract art has a different relationship to aesthetics because it aims to be beautiful or visually interesting. When it comes to diagrams, beauty and aesthetics aren't the primary objectives. A diagram wants to convey information, and that is its primary objective. This is my version of The Scream by Edvard Munch. The version by Munch is full of despair, therefore it's difficult to say that art is always concerned with beauty. Sometimes art conveys immense sorrow, and many artists have painted their own despair. Edvard Munch is one example of that. When I created this image, I didn't feel the immense sorrow present in the version by Munch. It became an exploration of how Munch expressed his feelings. After a painful experience, I created another version of the same image. This piece is called A Silent Scream, and it conveys my emotions at the time. It's probably one of the darkest pictures that I've ever created, and its main focus wasn't beauty or aesthetics. I needed to face my own feelings. I needed to express my own sorrows so I could find peace. The main focus of this piece was expressing my emotions. In some ways, it could be seen as conveying information. However, diagrams communicate facts, and this piece expresses emotion. Diagrams tend to be stripped of any emotion so they can convey factual information. When I turn a bar chart into abstract art, it conveys a level of emotion that would seem inappropriate in a diagram. This humanity is so easily found within a brushstroke. In those paint marks, we can see that an artist has created the work. In a diagram, the paint marks are removed. The diagram's flat colour attempts to remove all signs that it was made by a human hand. Diagrams aim to be statistics and facts in a visual form, and to do this, brushstrokes are banned from these visuals. If someone added them to a diagram, it would break an unwritten rule. Brushstrokes can emotionally charge any subject matter. Many contemporary artists create artwork designed to make people look at the small aspects of daily life. They want them to see familiar things in a new way. They make paintings of everyday objects, and they use visible brushstrokes to achieve their objectives. These brushstrokes speak to us on an emotional level, and we reevaluate our connection to these everyday items. Culturally, we have come to view brushstrokes as an indication of the type of artwork we are viewing. Diagrams convey analytical thought. If you want the viewer to see your artwork as something that speaks to the intellect, then you could make it look more like a diagram. Many artists choose not to create artwork that includes brushstrokes or any visible mark making. Brushstrokes are a fundamental aspect of the aesthetics of a piece of artwork. Many conceptual artists attempt to strip a piece of artwork of any aesthetic considerations. This is because they don't want to aim for beauty or visual interest. If you go into any gallery, you will see work with no aesthetic value. That's intentional because these artists don't want their artwork to speak to you on an emotional level. They want you to immediately recognize it as a piece of artwork that is designed to speak to your intellect. These artworks have a lot in common with diagrams. The artists have aimed to convey information, and they have given aesthetics a lower priority. This is one of the pieces that I created on a computer, and when I work digitally, I still use brushstrokes. They could easily be removed, but it would limit my expression. I could make my artwork cleaner and force it to hide the aspects that reveal my emotions and humanity, but it isn't the kind of artwork that I want to create. I sometimes feel that the artist is presented with a false choice that suggests that you must choose to convey either your emotions or your intellect. It suggests that one must be prioritized over the other. I don't think that is true, and I aim to create artwork that is an expression of all that I am. When I create artwork based on diagrams, it gives me an excellent opportunity to explore the similarities and differences between art and diagrams. I began to think about the role of colour. When you look at diagrams, the colours often represent something specific. There is sometimes a key that explains what each colour represents. Colour becomes clear and defined when we look at diagrams. It becomes a tool to convey information. In a piece of artwork, the role of colour is different. Its use isn't clearly explained, but that doesn't imply that each colour is without meaning. Each colour has a meaning, and whenever you choose a colour, it conveys that meaning. For example, green has associations with nature and can have a grounding effect on the viewer. Blue is calming, and it speaks of openness and communication. A deep blue can remind you of the ocean. Orange can bring much needed warmth to complement a cool ocean. Each colour contains many meanings, and their meanings can be altered by how they are used. Diagrams adopt a simplistic use of colour, but the use of colour is complex in a piece of art. That complexity allows artists to express complex emotions and a high level of information. The use of colour in a diagram is conscious and deliberate. The same is true for many pieces of artwork. The artist doesn't choose a colour just because it's there. Sometimes the process is instinctual, and at other times it is a conscious decision. Colour has meaning, and when I look at diagrams, it reminds me of its ability to convey information. This is true for diagrams, and it is true for art. This is my last abstract piece using a bar chart as a starting point. I'm not sure how many images I could have created using the same starting point. Rectangles are a basic shape, so they are an excellent starting point for any piece of abstract art. I would recommend that you attempt this activity because the process is educational. When you repeat the same starting point over and over, the images begin to become more experimental because you're constantly trying to find new ways of working. It is a process that is full of creativity. I created over 100 versions of the Mona Lisa. By making these artworks, I began to understand the value of experimenting with the same starting point. I would find different things interesting at different times, and the pieces contain a lot of variety. It is a process that really helps you to nurture your own creativity. When you start a piece of artwork, there seems to be endless possibilities and different ways to create the piece. Sometimes there are too many ideas for one piece of artwork. When you use the same starting point repeatedly, you begin to explore every path instead of having to choose one idea to work with. In the series of artworks based on bar charts, I'm using a simplistic starting point. However, when I created images using the Mona Lisa as my inspiration, I used a complex starting point. The image of the Mona Lisa uses lots of complex shapes. This isn't to say that a complex starting point that is full of detail is more challenging to work with than the simple rectangle shapes that are part of a bar chart. The demands on your creativity are the same. When you use the same starting point, it encourages you to be more experimental, because it doesn't matter if an image is terrible, because you already plan on starting again. There is no negative consequence of making a mistake, and that makes the process liberating. You would think that a series would feel constraining, but you only constrained one aspect, allowing for more creativity and freedom in other areas. You've added limitation to the starting point, but that encourages you to think more about colour, mark making, abstraction, shape, and composition. Every other area demands more focus, and this leads to greater creativity. We've used bar charts as a starting point, but they are not the only type of diagram that we can use. I want to look at Venn diagrams. These diagrams use the visual of interlocking circles to show the relationship between separate groups. One circle might represent people who like oranges, and the second circle might show the people who like apples. The place where the circles overlap would show the people who like both. That's an incredibly simple example of what these diagrams can be used for, and they do have many uses. When a circle is drawn from a single line, it is a circle, but the artist can easily turn a circle into a sphere. To do this, they change the value of the colour. When I say value, I'm referring to how light or dark the colour is. Those changes give the circle a three-dimensional quality that turns it into a sphere. In this instance, the circle is dark around the edge, and then it becomes lighter as you come towards its centre. This technique of making objects look three-dimensional is something that comes from the creation of realistic artwork. However, these are also tools that the abstract artist can use to improve the images that they create. In abstract artwork, you can use changes in light and shade, and you can easily mix those shapes with other abstract forms that are created from flat colour. This image shows how that is possible. This is only a work in progress, but at this stage, it balances those two types of abstract shape, and you will notice that when you have a limited range of colours, this works well. You are adding complexity to the level of light and shade. The image uses high levels of contrast to create the complexity needed. The high levels of contrast can be seen in the difference between areas with flat colour and areas with subtle light and dark changes. It's then balanced by the simplicity that is created by the limited range of colours. A limited range of colours is a lower level of contrast. In my work, these flat abstract shapes don't always stay flat. I want to add light and shade, but I don't always do that straight away. Using a flat colour allows me to focus on where I'm positioning the objects. You will notice that when I add the flat colour, the image doesn't look right. The image has become unbalanced, and that's because the limited range of colour provided the balance needed. I've created a high level of contrast when it comes to colour, and it needs to be balanced with simplicity and a lower level of contrast in another area. In some spaces, the colour is entirely flat, but in other areas, it has shape and depth. This is something that is creating a high level of contrast. I can reduce that level of contrast by adding more light and shadow to those areas that are just flat colour. The change of light and shade is now becoming more constant across the piece. There is a lower level of contrast and the piece is becoming more balanced. You will notice that in the final image, I've added the smallest amount of flat colour on that right circle. That slight imbalance draws the eye to that area. When you are working with high amounts of colour, you need to constantly work to balance the composition. Circles are a powerful tool in abstract images because these are simplistic shapes. If you have an image with lots of detail and complexity, then a simple shape can balance that complexity. When you add a simple shape like a circle, it can bring balance to an image. I'll create an image as an example. I'm making this image complex to begin with. Every piece of artwork needs to find a balance between complexity and simplicity. In this image, the structure is full of complexity, but there is a limited range of colours, and I did this because I wanted us to solely focus on the structure. But I can show you what it looks like with colour. There are 3 colours instead of 2, and you can already tell that the image is far too complex. Some white might help the image because it would remove some of that colour, but it shows how the structure is too complex. It would be good if the image could handle more than 3 colours. Let's move this image back to black and white and simplify the structure. Adding a large circle immediately simplifies the structure. There is more balance. When you look at this circle, you'll notice that the thickness of the lines is in keeping with the rest of the image. Those abstract shapes are made from lines that are of the same thickness. It is only the shape's simplicity that makes it stand out. It is the first thing you notice about this image because there is more balance to the composition. We can easily add more colour without the picture looking too complex. I'm adding colour and variations in light and shade, and the image still doesn't seem overly complicated. It's comfortable to look at and it isn't overpowering. The circle has helped me to achieve a balanced composition. When I create images using Venn diagrams, I'm really just using the circles. This is a shape that works well in abstract art because it's an important shape in art. Even when you are looking at realistic artwork, you will notice many real-world objects with circular shapes. It is an important basic shape that is just as significant as the rectangle. You can't create artwork without understanding basic shapes. This is a drawing that I created about childhood, and that is the title of the piece. When you were a child, you will have drawn a house. Most people will have drawn a house at some stage in their life. When you first drew a house, it will have been mainly basic shapes. There will have been many squares and rectangles and perhaps a circle to represent the sun. These basic shapes are the beginning of any piece of artwork, and they are the beginning of learning to draw. This is my drawing of an apple. If I had drawn an apple when I was a child, it would have been a circle. It might have had a sharp vertical line to indicate the stem, but the apple would have just been a circle. When your drawing abilities improve, it ceases to be a circle. We begin to recognize that it's a circle that needs to be altered. There are slight changes that need to be made to make it look more like an apple. We go through this process for many of the objects that we see in the real world. We notice the simple shapes, and then we learn how that shape needs to be altered. Simple shapes are a necessary part of creating any piece of artwork. Therefore, it is valuable to consider circles as a starting point. When I use Venn diagrams as a starting point, I'm really just using the image of interlocking circles. Circles are the main starting point. When I add other abstract shapes to the images, these circles become altered. They become like the apple, where alterations create something new. It isn't a process where I'm aiming for realism, but it is a process that uses aspects of that technique. Creating realistic images can improve your ability to create abstracts because you use some of the same techniques. These abstract circles are being altered to become something more unique. A circle can be the sun, an apple, a ball, but when you add details or alter the shape of the edge, then it begins to become something more specific. It ceases to just be a circle. And when this happens, the image becomes more interesting. This is true for both realism and abstraction. Whenever you add something to the canvas, it creates an imbalance. At this stage in the process, this is a cold canvas because these are cold colours. This creates one effect, and it's something you might want to keep. An unbalanced canvas isn't always a negative thing. The artist Picasso painted many pictures mainly using the colour blue and also a bluish green. It isn't wrong to have a mostly cool canvas, although it does create a particular effect. In Picasso's work, it expressed sorrow. This is one of my paintings, and it is mainly painted using blues and a small amount of grey. Using only blues doesn't always lead to images that are full of sorrow. This image conveys peace and calm, but that is partly due to the delicate brushstrokes and the light shades of blue. Sometimes using one colour is useful for what you want to express. All images require balance. This simplistic use of colour is balanced by the complexity that can be found in the textures and the complex shapes that form the background. Without that complexity, the piece would be unbalanced. I'll remove all of those aspects so you can see the imbalance. You will notice that the piece no longer looks finished. Any artist looking at this piece would immediately talk about what they would add to the piece. And whenever an artist does this, they have spotted an imbalance. When something looks unbalanced, it appears unfinished because it's constantly asking for something to be added to the canvas, but the artist hasn't included it. When I add the texture and complex shapes, the piece immediately seems finished because it's balanced. Everything that you place on the canvas asks for something else to balance it. You can use a limited selection of colours, but it requires skill. In this image, it doesn't work because I have simple colours and simple shapes. Those brushstrokes seem out of place because they are the only thing in this image that has any complexity, and the complexity it provides isn't enough to balance the image. So I want to make the colours and shapes more complex. Let's begin with the colours. Whenever something is placed on the canvas, it asks for something else to balance it. When this blue is placed on the canvas, what does it ask for? Cold colours ask for warmth, and blue's natural complement is the colour orange. This colour immediately adds balance to the blue, but the image still needs more complexity to balance those simple shapes. I add yellow to the canvas, and it isn't responding to any colour that is already present on the canvas, so it seems out of place. Yet I've purposely added imbalance, knowing that I can respond to it later on. Yellow asks for purple because it is its complementary colour. However, the image still doesn't have the level of complexity that is needed to balance those simple shapes. The image is relatively flat, and needs more variation in light and shade. I add the light and shade, and the image still needs more complexity, so in the final stages I add more details. At this stage the piece becomes balanced. Creating artwork based on Venn diagrams and bar charts is an easy thing to do because these diagrams contain the basic shapes that are a key part of creating any kind of visual imagery. We separate art and diagrams into different categories, and it is useful to label them in different ways. However, they are both forms of visual communication and they share a lot in common. When you explore the relationship between different types of visual communication, you learn more about each type. The process has helped me to understand more about the relationships between art and diagrams.